All right, we'll get started momentarily here. I want to give everyone a second or two more to trickle in. Okay, let's get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. I appreciate your patience. We're just having a little bit of technical difficulties, but I think we are off and running now. I'm John S. Van Oudenaren, China Program Manager and China Brief Editor-in-Chief at the Jamestown Foundation. Today, we're going to take a look at China's growing involvement in the politics of the Middle East. And the reason we organized this event is specifically in response to the deal brokered last month between Iran and Saudi Arabia by Beijing. The diplomatic breakthrough followed Iranian President
Ouch.
GCC summits. In a sign that Beijing continues to continue to play a role in regional diplomacy, days after the deal, the Wall Street Journal reported that China is working on brokering a Iran GCC summit, and that is potentially in the works for later this year. Nevertheless, despite China's expanding role in Middle Eastern geopolitics, the extent of its influence in the region remains a matter of debate, and we're going to get into that debate today. So we have three standout experts to join us here today. First, we have Andrea Gazzelli, who's an assistant professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University, and is the author of an excellent book on protecting China's interests overseas, securitization, and foreign policy. And Andrea, thank you so much for joining us. It's in the evening your time, so thank you. Next, we have Sine Oskarashin. She's a analyst in security and the defense program at the Istanbul-based think tank, the Center for Economic and Foreign Policy Studies, EDEM. And Sine holds an undergraduate degree from Leiden University and an MSc from Sciences Po Paris. And she's really looks extensively at emerging defense technologies and how those are reshaping the current geopolitical landscape across Eurasia. And finally, we have Alex Vatanka, who's the founding director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute. He was formerly a senior analyst at Jane's Information Group in London, and he writes a great deal on Iranian politics and Iranian foreign relations. So, Andrea, let's go over to you, and maybe you can talk us through how this looks from China's perspective. What was motivating China? And I think we were talking a little bit before, and you said you were a bit surprised, actually, and people in China were a bit surprised. Thanks, Andrea.
Correct. So, first of all, thanks a lot, John, for the invitation to be one of the speakers of this event. So it's a great pleasure. So yes, as I said earlier, before the event started, I was saying that this recent tripartite statement between China, the Saudis, the Chinese, the Saudis, and the Iranians caught me a bit off guard. And I also think that my feeling is that also a lot of people in China were caught a bit off guard, as much as those abroad. But it's sad. I will not. I will just try to give an overview of where I see how I see at the very least China looking at the region, and then trying to also to use that a bit as a context to just give a brief comment on this new statement, so that maybe that can be also the foundation for discussion later on. And again, I think the basic direction of China's Middle East policy has not really changed significantly, even with this agreement. My impression, following a bit the Chinese debate, reading Chinese articles and media publications, what Chinese experts write about what's going on in the region, dynamics within the main countries there, the main powers there, and especially U.S. policy toward the region, I think we can say that the Middle East, to a large extent, is the most important among the least important regions for Chinese foreign policy, in the sense that it occupies this very somehow we can say awkward position from Beijing, in the sense that it is true that China has a variety of interests there, or some of them extremely important, from think about terrorism, energy security, and so far. So of course, these of course are many countries there are important players in regional politics, and also of course at the United Nations. We saw that, and probably the war in Ukraine has made this region actually even more important from a Chinese perspective, in terms of keep on expanding diplomatic clout, security in energy, and so far and so on. But that said, at least for a long time, my impression is that although there was an agreement among Chinese experts in China that this region is important, there was no agreement about which of these many interests is the most important one. In the sense, they all can, damaging this interest, the fall of friendly regime, disruption of energy supplies, and so far as on, can threaten China. But none of them alone, it can really pose an existential threat to China, especially in a moment as there is so much going on inside and outside the country. And in this case, I like to, in all the things that I've written, I've been writing recently on China and the Middle East, I really like to cite this paper that was written by the head of the African Affairs Department of Kikir, Li Wentao, it's his name, in which he said, our interests have expanded so much around the globe, but at the same time, our diplomatic resources, or in Chinese, 外交资源, have not also expanded as much. And so, long story short, we have to prioritize. And oftentimes, these regions, Africa, the Middle East, and so far and so on, we cannot invest as much, enough resources to protect or expand our interest more than we do at the moment. And these, I think this comment takes place against the background of more kind of, I would say, Middle East specific comments that usually goes like, we do not understand the region enough. There is a lack of expertise. That this lack of expertise is slowly disappearing, but still a work in progress. Also, there are coordination problems. There are so many actors involved in there, state-owned companies, sometimes provincial governments, different agencies, so far and so on. And sometimes even what we think are right strategic choices maybe end up in policy failures because of implementation issues. Usually, for example, the necessity to evacuate 36,000 people from Libya at the very last moment is mentioned as one of such most evident products of this lack of coordination among different actors. And so this is why, given all this, sometimes this is why I say that this region is important, but at the same time, there's no real agreement about how much important it is. And I think to a large extent, again, there was this general cacophony of voices about what to do about the region. Of course, there was some general agreement, some general consensus, such as better not get too much involved in regional politics, because once you get, you take side with one, it's very difficult to districate. Better avoid military presence because, again, resources. Also, let's learn from what other countries have done. But that said, I think only now there's been only recent years, I would say, especially since the Trump administration, and now it continues under Biden. I think there is a growth. This debate is changing a bit with at least from the Chinese perspective, the impression that whereas before the Middle East could be a place where somehow these tensions between Washington and Beijing could be sometimes and somehow set aside, maybe try to cooperate a bit, try to cool down a bit the tensions that were rising in Asia. This is not possible anymore, but there is the growing fear that somehow Middle East Indo-Pacific strategy of containment is emerging, and I think that probably will provide some more, say, coherency to the direction of China's policy in the region. But nonetheless, I think that this possible growing coherency, I don't think it will necessarily lead to a fundamental change in the ultimate vision that China has for the region, which is a region that is focused on economic development first, rather than rivalries and war and so forth. And this, of course, is deeply rooted in China's own experience and also foreign policy tenet that stability grows out of economic development. And so I don't think that has changed and is not going to change. Also, I think that I don't think is going to change is the kind of weapons of preference, so the tool of the toolcraft of preference that China adopts in the Middle East. It is essentially economic engagement first and foremost. I don't think that security. Maybe we can have some kind of development of security cooperation, especially think about, of course, sales of weapons and such kind of things, but nothing, at least I don't think in the foreseeable future, that resembles, more like the American approach in terms of deployment of troops and so on. And after all, I think at the same time, China does not really need to change its direction. And with this, I go toward the comment, give my 2 cents on the recent statement between the Saudis and the Iranians. I think that clearly shows that probably they would be clearly seen in Beijing as the proof of the fact that their approach is working, that their interpretation of what the region should become and the direction that the region is going to is the correct one. And this is why I think, to a large extent, this is why I'm saying that this statement and the role that China played in the last part of the negotiations and playing the role of host does not really herald the beginning of a new era of Chinese primacy in the region. If we look at and definitely the two other speakers will have more to say on how the other countries look at it, but what I understand, it was a mix of China-specific and Saudi and Iranian-specific factors. On the Chinese side, I think we cannot but notice the direct involvement of the top leader, Xi Jinping. That if we look at the previous efforts made by the Chinese to mediate before the JCPOA, it was another case in which Xi Jinping also probably played an important role, personally giving the input, providing diplomatic cover. And in this case, he was literally there, first in December in Riyadh, and then Austin Raisi a few months later. And so that, of course, provides a quantity of political, diplomatic, and bureaucratic power that I don't think China's Middle East policy usually enjoys. So that was on the China side of the story. And of course, this allowed to achieve many goals at the same time, scoring diplomatic points against the United States, helping the region to go in a direction that it's its favorite one. After all, many Chinese scholars have often said that the division between Sunni and Shias in the region is fabricated, something that was created by the Americans to isolate Iran, which is something that China has always been against. But of course, then there were also regional specific side. Definitely for the Saudis, it made a lot of sense to involve the Chinese to, at the very least, increase sunken costs for the Iranian and stick to the deal, possibly. It allowed the Saudi leadership to increase to put pressure on Washington in negotiating growing security commitments. And on the Iranian side, well, scoring diplomatic points at this point, given the the difficulties at home, is an important source of, it's important. And therefore, on the one hand, being easing up the tensions with the Saudis, showing, bringing to public opinion this diplomatic breakthrough is all important on that side. And so this is why I'm saying I will not read too much into this event, but most likely I think it will strengthen it, to reinforce the Chinese conviction that their approach, the current approach, which is the one that they've kept for a while, is the right one. And they do not need to invest more energies or to be more active or anything, because on the one hand, we can say that there is much more harmony. And I personally agree with this assessment that I think is the Chinese one, that there's much more harmony between the ultimate interest of China in terms of goals and preferred tools of statecraft employed with those of the main players in the region at the moment, in comparison to, let's say, those local regional policymakers and the United States, for example. And so again, no need to change, no need to see this as a result of change in China's behavior, but more the product of continuity in Chinese behavior. So maybe I'll stop here. I think this and of course I look forward to be disconfirmed by Alex and Sina. Definitely they know more than me on the politics of the other countries, but I think this is how it's seen, at the very least, from China.
Thanks, Andrea, for that good overview of China's perspective. Alex, let's go to you next, because I think this is not a deal the U.S. Could have brought through with Iran. So if you can talk through, Iran's calculus in this, why they brought in China. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I think, John, the United States could not have done this simply because the United States doesn't have diplomatic relations with Iran. You could argue that it doesn't really have leverage over Iran. It does have hard power that it can bring to bear, but in the context of trying to bring about a diplomatic resolution or a diplomatic track between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the use of hard power was not really relevant. So the U.S. essentially didn't have much of a leverage in this context. And that's why the Chinese came in and were able to become the venue for this. And it's important to point that out. So far, it's early days, but so far what China has done is act as the sort of venue and score, if you will, a diplomatic point against the United States. It's really important, though, not to underestimate what this could mean symbolically, but also in practice going forward. I think what the Chinese narrative could become, I'm not sure if we're there yet, but you heard Andrea sort of touch on some of that. But what the Chinese narrative could become, and it's certainly what friends of China in the Middle East are pointing at, is as an alternative, China wants to be not just a deal breaker, but a peacemaker. And what the narrative also says, and this is where the United States needs to be worried, the contrast to the Chinese model is the American model, which Beijing wants to portray as one of basically either warmongering or deliberately creating tensions in regions of the world, such as the Middle East. Andrea mentioned the Sunni-Shia differences are seen by China as a deliberate American fabrication to keep the region divided so the United States could keep, I assume, more arms to the region. That's one way of looking at the Sunni-Shia conflict. I agree that the Sunni-Shia conflict is not that deep, but the idea, if this is what China will sort of perhaps suggest to the rest of the world, that this was deliberately fabricated with the United States, is an oversimplification of the tensions that have existed in the Middle East, certainly since 1979, when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. So back to your question, John, in terms of where we are. China has done this deal, but the deal was underway way before. You can go back to 2018 and 19, where certainly by 2019, where the Saudis realized that President Trump's maximum pressure campaign on Iran was not having the kind of results that they have hoped to see. They wanted the U.S. more forcefully contain Iran, and the opposite essentially happened with the 2019 attack by the Iranians against oil facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia. That was a wake-up call for the Saudis. Before this happened, Saudi Arabia's partner in the Yemen war, United Arab Emirates, had decided to pull out of the war in Yemen, realizing that these, military interventions in the regions, whether it's been Yemen, Libya, Syria, were costly, were not a core interest of a country like UAE. The Saudis kind of accepted the same message. This is why you see Saudi Arabia now focused on nation building at home, pulling back from the region. They don't care if Iran wants Lebanon, if Iran wants Syria, let Iran have it. We're going to focus on economic development. So that's where the Saudis were at in the last few weeks when the Chinese intervened, or were asked to, I assume. I tend to agree with Andrea. I doubt China has the kind of Middle East expertise and clout to be able to have brokered this on their own. The only reason the Chinese could do it was because the Iranians and the Saudis, for their own reasons, had already a deal pretty much ready. And again, for your listeners to our panel here, these talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia began in April of 2021 in Baghdad. And there have been 5 rounds of talks. The Iraqis were involved, the Omanis were involved, others have been involved. So this mediation was not something that just happened overnight. The Chinese just came in, were able to create, as I said, provide the venue. And I'm sure that was deliberate. I'm sure that was deliberate both for Iran and for the Saudis. That was really a sort of a poking the United States, particularly the Saudis. The Saudi position right now is, diversifying their foreign policy options. They have certainly not given up on the United States. I see no indication that Saudi Arabia or any of the Gulf states want to see China come in and replace the United States, despite the fact that China is today their biggest trading partner. For all the states in the Middle East, China happens to be the number 1 or number 2 trading partner. But none of them see China in the short term replacing the United States as a security guarantor. And that's why how much China can sort of, if you will, take advantage of what it did on the 10th of March in bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia together is going to be limited. Now, there will be pressure on China to keep the feet of the Iranians and the Saudis close to the fire and make sure they deliver. I suspect by end of Ramadan, you can see the Iranian and the Saudi embassies reopen. That would be important. I suspect you can see the Bahrainis also reopen their embassy at some point in the near future. There's much talk on that front. The other Gulf states, Oman, UAE, and others already are way ahead in their sort of rapprochement. So that's where we are now. But I do want to say something in terms of not pushing back on what Andrea said, because Andrea succinctly put forward the view from China. But I was taken by the sentence, Middle East is the most important among the least important regions in the world for China. Look, if China wants to replace the United States as the superpower on the global stage, that cannot be Beijing's position on the Middle East. Middle East is critically important for various reasons. Energy was mentioned. That's true. China gets about half of its oil. Terrorism and other issues are linked to what is happening in the Middle East. So the idea that China can just focus on developing ports and railroad systems and so on in Africa and then, let Middle East go its own merry way, I don't think that can be a long-term plan for the Chinese if they are serious about, as I said, replacing, if you will, the United States. So for me, as of now, it's not that China doesn't want to do it, play a bigger role. I think it's because China can do it, because the Middle East is still very much deeply rooted in the Middle East, in pretty much all the countries, with the exception, obviously, of Iran. And that's more or less to Iran's loss. It's not to United States' loss. It is to some extent also a problem for the United States. But if you listen to the Iranians debating this issue among themselves, there are plenty of people in Tehran who actually wonder if this deal that China brokered between Saudi Arabia and Iran is in the end that great of a deal for Iran, or whether it's enough. 2 points about that, and I'll stop, John. Number one is that China has so much now leverage over Iran that they can basically tell the Iranians what to do on a given important issue, like what to do with the Saudis. That's the leverage China has been able to accumulate over Iran. That's not necessarily healthy for Iranian foreign policy. And those people who have this view argue that a healthier version of an Iranian foreign policy would be would they also had relations or balanced interests vis-a-vis the West, the Europeans and Americans, because that would then not put China in such a dominant position. Because right now, China, in fact, let me give you two statistics. Iran, I think in 2022, traded with China, its biggest trading partner, for about $16 billion. China traded for about $90 billion with Saudi Arabia. So the Chinese-Saudi economic relations, it's much more important to Beijing than the Iranian economic relations with Beijing. And that means essentially if China was pushed, China would choose Saudi Arabia. And Iran doesn't have the West and that balanced foreign policy to turn to the West and say, hey, can you help me out here? I need a bit of support because the Chinese and Saudis are ganging up against me. That's not an option for Iran, and that's not a good place for the Iranians, and they know it, but there you have it. Their foreign policy has been since 1979. So essentially anti-American, although they don't see it that way. They see the Americans being after them. But I would argue that it's the product of Iranian ideological commitment to a model of anti-Americanism that has put them in a position with essentially the Chinese, if Iran is not careful, becomes a sort of another colony with certainly a satellite state of sorts for the Chinese. That is already happening. Iran doesn't have many trading partners. Most of its oil goes to China, reportedly at a steep discount. And the Iranians don't have alternatives. Again, that's not a good position for them to be in. But that's just looking at it from an Iranian perspective. I'll stop here. There are obviously many other issues involved when we talk about China in the Middle East. But let me stop there, John, and then we can take other issues in turn.
Thanks, Alex, for that excellent overview. And I think that sets us up nicely. You obviously touched on the Saudis wanting to bring in China for the deal. And let's go now over to Sine. She's going to talk us through the Saudi role here. And I think Saudi Arabia is really the big moving piece, right, in terms of being willing to go through China. So we've got some slides here. Sine, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here amongst such distinguished colleagues. So I'll mainly echo what has been previously discussed, actually, and adding on the zoom in Saudi perspective to the things. So next slide, please. Okay, so these relations are actually threefold, and like Adria discussed in detail, they're like mainly economic and transactional, and that was the main factor that defined these relations up until very recently. So we had the Belt and Road Initiative, which also Saudi Arabia participates in. This is also pretty much aligned with the country's vision moving forward in 2030, and also booming trade that we've also touched upon. And as the deal suggests, it is also quite political. So it's rooted in this principle of like asking no questions, not getting involved in each other's domestic affairs, internal politics. And that has really served both sides well up until now and provided a good alternative for the Gulf states when we compare Beijing to Washington in that sense. But what I really like to touch up on today is the strategic aspect. And I think this is what drives Chinese and the Gulf relations today. We have a burgeoning military cooperation with huge arms transfers, a lot of joint drills happening, and supplying of critical technology, but also the Chinese footprint in the Saudi ballistic missile program is what I want to focus on going forward. Next slide, please. Okay, we've discussed this previously, but what does it mean, this new deal? What does it mean for regional security? What does it mean for Chinese position in the Middle East? So yes, so far it is still quite premature. It has only provided the room to talk. So the both parties, like Mr. Alex also put, decided what to do themselves and basically granted China with this diplomatic victory on a golden tray, because we know that talks were previously held in Oman, we know that they were held in Iraq, but this conscious choice of making China the star at the end of the day is really geostrategically meaningful. And again, alarmingly for Washington, it really improved China's like both position and the image in the region. So yes, from a economic partner, we see China moving to a strategic partner that can offer the regional countries of peace. Next slide, please. Okay, moving forward, the main thing that I also wrote in my Jamestown article is the Saudi ballistic missile program. Why is this important? It is both important for regional security, but also very important for the future trajectory of the deal, as well as the bilateral relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So far, the Saudis have like previously requested like numerous arms from Washington, like including drones very recently, which were pretty much either like kept on hold or were neglected. So in search of new alternatives, also familiar with Chinese missile technologies beforehand, we see the Saudis moving closer to China in supporting their own indigenous strategic programs in the military segment, which is critical for the power balance in the region, but also it can provide Saudi Arabia with nuclear capabilities, which will be a wild card for both the region, but like I said, also for the Saudi Arabia-Iran relations. Because the Chinese missiles that Beijing previously sent to Saudi Arabia come with dual-use warheads. So now, under a potential collaboration that we see also in the satellite imagery, which we acquired from only open source intelligence resources, tells us that the allegedly only economic partnership has moved to a much deeper strategic partnership that can be very hard to turn around. Next slide, please. And another catalyst for the Chinese leverage and position in the Middle East I want to touch upon is the technology. So here we see China coming in and providing the regional countries with critical technologies that Washington can, but it does not provide. So filling a very critical gap here, we see China and Chinese tech giants such as Huawei cooperating and even setting up Middle Eastern countries' 5G infrastructures, telecommunication systems, and cloud computing systems. And we see how this created a rift previously between Washington and its Middle Eastern allies in the United Arab Emirates snub regarding the F-35s, as you might very well remember. So we see the regional priorities are changing. The industries of the future are gaining a critical importance. And in some cases, they're becoming even more important than sophisticated fighter jets, for example, and the F-35s. So yes, the need for the US is still there, but the regional countries also have other important points on their agenda, which are coming to a play increasingly. Next slide, please. Okay, to conclude, can we say the game's over for Washington and the Middle East? Well, definitely not. But what I'd really like to stress is that the region's going through a geopolitical shift, and we're witnessing winds of change that unfortunately work against the West's favor. So yes, the US is still a major security partner. The Gulf states' defense ecosystems are designed based on the Western principles, but we see an increasing amount of Chinese influence coming into play, all in the economic sides, political, as well as in the military and strategic sides, which we cannot neglect. And I think before we finish up, it's really important to remember that China is not a friend in the Middle East. Yes, we can cooperate with it, on certain points, but whatever China does in the region, it's not to serve US interests. Because I've been reading out a lot about these Chinese broker deal can also like help the US. I mean, I doubt that. I mean, it can, but we need a serious policy shift in the US. We need a different approach if that's going to be the case. And we have a major, strategic major threat in the Middle East, that is China, and it is like manifesting itself in all the economic domains, the critical technologies, and military strategic aspects. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sine, for that overview. I'd like to now open things up to our audience, and you can raise your hand virtually or type in a question in the question box. I guess as questions come in, maybe I'll start things off by asking, and maybe let's start with you, Alex and Sine. What should the US response be to China's growing role in the region? Should the US kind of continue to play, take a fairly tough position on the Saudis and sort of play hard to get? Should they re-engage with the Gulf states? Should they try to open to Iran? What approach should the US take in response? Maybe Alex, if you can maybe take a first crack at that if you're open to it.
Sure, John. I'll try. Look, I think number one, sitting here in Washington the last few weeks, a lot of folks have been making the argument that, yeah, this broker deal that China managed between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's surprising to some extent, but not a big deal. It doesn't make any difference in the big scheme of things. And to some extent, I agree with that, because as we discussed earlier, so much depends on China's ability to continue to make itself relevant going forward. And that's a big if. One thing is to be able to deliver on the economic front for the states of the region, but they happen to be mostly smaller countries with serious concerns about their security. So they do need a serious security guarantor. And that's a Chinese challenge. I mean, how does China want to come in and replace the about 50,000 American troops that are deployed in every single pretty much country in the region? That's not an easy task to do. That's taking the United States pretty much the Second World War to put together, and to replace it is going to be a major challenge for anybody, and even China. So, but all that said, I think on the Washington side, this idea that this deal was not a major change could be, I think, perhaps a bit too, let me just say, it could be the wrong way of looking at it. China, if it decides to come in to the Middle East in a stronger, more forceful fashion, does have the option to also introduce itself as a military and security partner. And to some extent, that's already happening. You know, Russia, Iran, and China just recently, a few weeks ago, I think it was their third trilateral military drills that they held in the Gulf of Oman and the Northern Arabian Sea. Iran is now part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Saudi Arabia is in the process of becoming one. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is supposed to be Eurasia's NATO, has a lot to do in order to prove itself as a real sort of alliance. We haven't seen it yet, but it does have the potential in this new world that we live in, because of the fact that the two dominant players in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Russia and China, are today at loggerheads with the United States and, broadly speaking, the Western world. So that alliance could become one platform for countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other states in the Middle East perhaps to join. And I should remind everyone that Pakistan and India are also members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In other words, it's a mistake for the United States to just dismiss what happened in Beijing on the 10th of March as some, one-off. This could be the trend. I'm not saying it will be, but it could be. That depends on China's ability to present itself beyond just an economic partner for the countries of the Middle East. And that then pushes the United States to think differently. It is right now, as of today, the one almost irreplaceable security guarantor for most of the states, certainly the Gulf states. And that's not going to change overnight. But the United States needs to think long-term about what it is the Chinese are doing and the narrative that they're sending to the message that is resonating. And that narrative is simply one of, we will be helping the entire region build up its economy. We're here to create jobs, not just sell you expensive military platforms. And that's a direct challenge to the United States. So, long story short, the United States is a democracy. You don't do central planning, certainly not central economic planning. But there are options, perhaps, I would assume, for US administrations, the Biden administrations, and the ones to follow, to think along the lines of, for example, how do you challenge the Belt and Road Initiative of China? That since 2013, I was reading one recent report, has resulted in something like 920, I think it was, $1 billion of investments around the world, including in countries in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia and Iraq. So the United States needs to look at what China is doing in the Middle East as a test, as a challenge to present itself beyond just a military and security partner and guarantor, but also a country that actually is still the largest economy in the world. And with the right kind of collaboration between US policymakers and the US corporations, there could be a lot more American economic interest in the Middle East, which in turn could benefit the overall image of the United States. Because frankly, since the 9/11, the 22 so years, the US image has been one of its military might. And that alone is not going to cut it in the long term. That's a challenge China poses. So I hope the US takes that lesson, policymakers, and start thinking about creating ways of as I said, rebrand themselves to some extent going forward, certainly in the Middle East.
Sine, do you want to add to that, looking at from the perspective of the Saudis, but maybe also from Turkey, where you are, which is an important actor in the Middle East and obviously a U.S. NATO.
Thank you. So regarding the Turkey comments, the Turkey point, I'd like to say, at this point, Turkey would just sit back and watch. We have the elections coming up. We have the economic crisis on our shoulders. So I don't think there will be an imminent response from Ankara, just for now. But I think what's also Mr. Vatanka rightly touched upon is the need to find alternatives. So without presenting a viable alternative, without rebuilding that trust, without establishing a healthy dialogue, it's not going to work in the long run for Washington. It's going to become a deadlock. That's my take on it. And we still have the skepticisms of the both sides. So if China doesn't play its cards well, it can again serve Washington's interests. So we're gonna have to see what China does when a real crisis emerges, because the Saudi foreign minister himself stated that a lot of major hurdles remain in the bilateral relations. So we're going to see what China will do about those. And regarding the lacking expertise, lacking diplomatic resources that my colleagues touched on, it's going to be a challenge. So it's also a possibility that Beijing can mess things up on its own and indirectly serve Washington's hand in that regard.
Great. Thanks, Sine. Well, I want to take our first audience question, and I think this is a good one for you to answer, Andrea, which is looking at, we know that China's not the only Eastern power with a lot of ties with the Middle East, and of course, Japan and South Korea are major trading partners. How are they viewing sort of China's growing role in the Middle East? How does that intersect? Is it kind of running on separate tracks? Are there things that they could learn from each other? And have you maybe seen any kind of comments on that? Because I think Japan it's obviously less of a power, but it has a longer role, going back to the Gulf War and even longer, the oil crises of being involved in the region. So over to you, Andrea.
So it's a bit difficult question because I'm not an expert on Japanese or South Korean foreign policy. So I'll be honest, I'm not sure how they're looking at this situation. I guess my guess is that probably they're looking at a bit at how Washington will react and probably play a bit that tune. That would be my guess with that regard. Again, I think it's especially in this moment in which it's not really clear how long this, if and how this statement will produce results in the region, and what kind of results will produce. Probably at the moment, again, everyone is playing a bit of wait and see. I guess the proposed Iran GCC summit, I think that they've been talking about holding it in November would be an important milestone with that regard. Also for other countries to see how to react. That would be my guess. But for the moment, I think business as usual will be after a foreign policy, whereas we scholars and pundits and journalists like to kind of focus on the kind of breaking news and the most surprising events. I think policymakers have limited amount of time, so I think business as usual is the way of doing things unless there is a crisis. That said, I think also also Chinese media from time to time talk about India and South Korea and China and Japan in the Middle East, but they're always seen as kind of minor actors. Japan is from time to time mentioned, but none of these are really considered as well. The Chinese themselves do not consider China necessarily as I think they still consider the United States as the most influential power in the region, and this is not going to change for a long time. I don't think they have ambitions to change that or the capabilities to change that. But that said, probably they see themselves a bit, I can say, one step above maybe Japan or other Asian countries with regard to their influence or ambitions at the very least in the Middle East. So yeah, but again, this would be my comment with this.
Maybe
John,
I could. Oh, sorry, Alex, go ahead.
Just very quickly add, because in our conversation so far, we haven't touched on one key issue as much, which is it's not in the interest of Chinese to see tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia get out of control. If you remember when Iran hit those facilities in eastern Saudi Arabia in September of 2019, certainly this is what Iranian media reports suggest. The Chinese were quick to send a message to Tehran saying, hey, friends in Iran, when you hit the Saudis, you're not just hitting the Saudis, you're also hitting our interests. We depend on that oil coming from Saudi Arabia, which takes me to the question that just came in on the roles of other countries like Japan and South Korea. So these happen to be the biggest customers of almost all the Gulf oil and gas producers, from Qatar to Saudi Arabia and so on. So all of them, one way or another, are invested in this stability because their energy supply depends on it. And for some of them, like the U.S. allies, like South Korea and Japan, on a fundamental level, they are committed to their partnership with the United States. That's not going to change anytime soon. You see that with initiatives like AUKUS and so on recently. But I suspect there will be pressure from Tokyo and Seoul on Washington saying, listen, the Chinese are suddenly showing up with their warships more and more at the Strait of Hormuz. And that might be a problem for us because we have a history of both South Korea and Japan having had their tankers in recent years seized by Iran's Revolutionary Guards. So there is a sort of a kinetic potential here for, I'm not suggesting that China will ask the Revolutionary Guards to do certain things in order to undermine the interest of China's rivals in East Asia, like Japan and South Korea. But that is certainly an option that if I was sitting in Seoul or Tokyo, I would think, what can China do in the Middle East as it's sort of trying to find its, new muscular stance? What can the Chinese do to undermine the interest of countries like South Korea and China? And I think the real, in some ways, what they need to do is to have a conversation with the United States on that issue. And I'm sure that's happening as we speak.
Thanks, Alex. And I appreciate your point about taking it seriously, right? And people in kind of Washington writing it off, and I think one thing that might be interesting to talk about is how China's diplomacy with the Middle East and these new China-Arab summits, the China-GCC summits, how does that fit into China's broader multilateral efforts through things like the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative? Because we're seeing, China kind of stand up this, parallel international system. Andre, I don't know if you have anything to add about it. I would think, having Saudi Arabia in GSI, the fact that they just joined SCO, that's a major addition, and I would think would boost the prestige of those efforts.
Undoubtedly. I think that this statement, comes at a time in which China needs a lot of such kind of prestige, I would say. I think after the position paper on the war in Ukraine, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, at the very least in the West, about Chinese diplomats. I think many people were waiting for something, and they didn't see it coming. They didn't see any breakthrough. And I think so. In the context of these new initiatives, as well as the sort of short-term, not short-term, the long-term growing dissatisfaction in the West about Chinese foreign policy, bringing home this agreement is really a way to shift a bit the narrative, at least to some extent, not necessarily to win, new friends in Europe or the United States, but nonetheless to shift a bit the global narrative, which is in any case influenced by what it's said in the West, right? So it kind of helped a lot China, I believe, to gain some much needed initiative in a moment in which they were seen to a large extent in a passive, in a dialogue, not really knowing how to square and how to put together, how to harmonize all these different interests that they have vis-a-vis keeping stable at the various relations with the Europeans. At the same time, there is Russia, and so far and so on. So I think this agreement really is a major boon for Chinese diplomacy. And I would add also in the regional context, because especially after the Riyadh summits, which there was this joint China-GCC statement in which the disputes, the disputed islands between with Iran came up, I think, and then a lot of people interpreted Raisi coming to Beijing as, the Chinese trying to deal with this crisis. It actually turns out that it was not a reactive move, but it kind of looks like it was part of a bigger plan. It was all planned. So I think, a series of things. You can say at the global level with the new security initiative, in the more kind of medium term with the war in Ukraine, and in the short term in the aftermath of these summits in Riyadh. This statement really is I think people in Beijing really celebrated it a lot. That when finally Xinhua published the picture of Wang Yi and the heads of the Saudi and Iranian delegation holding hands, because it definitely provides a lot of new oxygen that Chinese diplomacy needs in this moment.
Thanks, Andre. I think that's some good insights. I think maybe in Washington, there's a tendency to look at the region through a securitized framework and not necessarily appreciating some of the economic growth and development in recent years. I do want to go over to you, Sine, because we have a question about technology transfer to the UAE. And I want to broaden it out because I think the UAE is another important actor, and I was thinking about how to include it, but I didn't want to make the event too complicated. But can you sort of talk about that? Is the UAE kind of, how do they factor in, right? Because I know they're not always, they're aligned with the Saudis, but they sometimes march to the beat of their own drum.
Yeah, so the UAE is another country that has major technological partnership with China right now, with numerous Chinese tech firms establishing joint ventures, cooperation dialogues, and like joint projects. So, and like I said in the F-35 example, it really shows that like the Emiratis are at the moment preferring like technological gains and technological freedom of operations over sophisticated fighter jets such as the F-35s. And what Washington thinks, quite rightly, in this context is that okay, if our most sophisticated aircraft in operation will operate under a Chinese 5G infrastructure, a Chinese cloud-based computing system, like it's not going to work for intellectual property rights. So like there's the dilemma there, but we see also the Emiratis weighing in quite a bit regarding their like technological competitiveness in that regard. So it's a deadlock, but it doesn't seem like both sides will back down in the near future. But I think they will have to come to a conclusion like eventually, as many countries are moving into the 5th and soon the 6th generation fighter jet generation.
Great. Well, I think our final question is a good one. It's from Agatha Monday, and I think it's an issue that's kind of been touched on tangentially, which is the role of Russia. And Agatha's asking, how much coordination is there, with China on around the Iran-Saudi Arabia agreement and the, trying to position itself as a broker in Ukraine. So maybe Andrea, if you can kind of talk about how those two things align, because I think you kind of mentioned them, but they all kind of came out in a flurry in late February and early March. We had this right around the two sessions, right before we had this tremendous burst of diplomatic activity. So maybe you can talk about that, and then Alex and Sine, if you can talk about perhaps how China and Russia interact vis-a-vis Iran and the Gulf. So Andrea, over to you.
Sure. So I would be careful in drawing a direct line between the two, in the sense that I do not think that China sees these successful negotiations leading to the tripartite agreement, as tripartite statement, as the stepping stone toward a more active role in Ukraine. I think I believe that many Chinese analysts would all agree with me saying that the two situations are vastly different, and so I think it's important to take the win that you can and then maybe do not exaggerate, not overstretch too much. So I do not think that that necessarily one is related to the other. But as I said, I think that it was a perception that it was important for China to add, to do something nonetheless on the global stage. And whereas the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is definitely one of the thorniest issues out there, I believe that honestly today for China, how to deal with this conflict is probably the second most difficult foreign policy issue that they have to face after how to manage the relations with Washington. Of course, the two are related with each other, but I think really the conflict in Ukraine is a major headache. And so in this context, being asked by the Saudis to play a role in bringing home this really historic agreement, I think for them was like, for sure, if there are so many challenges, but if we can be seen as part of this, change in the region, we definitely have to seize the opportunity. So I think this is the thing. I also think, and then I'll stop here, but simply because I just got a paper accepted on China's perception of Russia in the Middle East. I think there is also in China the idea that for a long time Russia has been, of course, China and Russia share quite a lot of interest and approaches to the Middle East, but at the same time Russia is also very similar to the old Western powers in being power hungry and eager to use military power. So if finally bringing some peace, try to bring some stability in the region. It's also useful to try to close a period in which Russia intervened in Syria, but at the same time show that the Chinese are fully aware of the fact that it doesn't have really the resources to play the role of builder, of neither physical builder nor peace builder or peacemaker. And so, if this, I think, can also be seen a bit as an attempt to try to finally push the region in direction that the Chinese prefer, rather than maybe at least what from Beijing looks like what the Russians or the Europeans or the Americans want.
Great. Yeah, some parallels there, I think, maybe between China and Russia and Africa as well, some similarities. Alex, can you talk a little bit about Russia and Iran, and maybe how Russia's involvement in Ukraine has impacted Iran's calculus here?
So the Iranians made a big decision back last summer when they were in a position to prioritize solving their nuclear standoff with the United States and the West. That was an option Iran had in the summer of 2022, but instead they decided to start shipping drones to Russia for its military campaign in Ukraine. So that was a very decisive moment for Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards. They basically have gambled that in the foreseeable future, a deal cannot be reached with the U.S. on the nuclear issue or anything for that matter. And they're putting their eggs in the basket of Russia in this case. Plenty of people in Iran are opposed to this, including folks inside the Iranian regime. They think, strategically speaking, a country like Russia, never mind the tortured history that we know existed between Russia and Persia or Soviet Union and Iran, never mind that, but there are structural reasons why this relationship will always be limited. Certainly in the economic field, Russia is a direct competitor for Iran. So, in the last year or so, plenty of evidence that Russia, as it has tried to replace the market share it lost in Europe, has tried to pick up market share in places like India, UAE, and so on, where Iran has been oftentimes at the receiving end, losing market share to Russia. So a direct economic competitor in some ways. Obviously, there is a lot in the news lately about military ties deepening, with the reports of the Sukhoi aircraft being sold to Iran, maybe even the S-400 air defense system and so on. But while relations between Iran and Russia are certainly in the last year have deepened, if nothing else for the reason that Russia was short of friends, and few countries turned to open the door to Vladimir Putin, who famously, I think he visited the first country outside the former Soviet Union. It was in July of last year when he visited Tehran. So there is that factor. A lack of option for Russia has made a country like Iran more important to them. And I would say for the Iranians, they have, because they have simply failed to figure out a way of the sort of dispute they have with Washington, and that's been true pretty much since 1979, they have limited their options on their part, and which makes a country like Russia just play that much more of an important role in their foreign policy than really it deserves when you think about the differences and disagreements that exist between Russia and Iran in terms of, as I said, for example, being competitors in the realm of energy markets and so on. But one final point I make, John, I'll stop. So much of this depends on whether Russia and China in the long term end up being the sort of captains of the non-democracies on the global stage against the democracy of this world. We just had the second democracy summit here in the United States. If this becomes the sort of mantra of not just the Biden administration, but future administrations, that we divide the world into democracies, you're with us, non-democracies, you're not with us, I think that obviously is going to make life so much harder for countries that are not democracies, but have been partners of the United States, like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, the entire Gulf state, and so on. I'm not sure if China and Russia are going to be able to deepen relations to that extent. I understand it. No, I'm not an economist, but I understand that China overall still depends much more on its economic transactions with the likes of the United States than we like to admit. So it's not that easy for China to suddenly sort of say, you know what, let's just have this all-out confrontation with the United States and the West. They're not there yet, but that could be where they are heading. And if they so choose, then Russia, countries like Iran could help them in that campaign. Again, I don't know if this is where the world is going, democracies versus non-democracies, but that sort of a black and white scenario ahead certainly is going to make it very important and a difficult decision a lot of countries like in the Middle East have to make in terms of which side they're going to land on. But let me stop there, John.
Thanks, Alex. I think that's a great point. It's been remarkable actually how much, and Andrea, you probably saw this, how much coverage there's been in the Chinese media of the U.S. Democracy Summit. There may even be more, I think, in Chinese state media than I've seen in, say, the Washington Post or New York Times. So it's certainly something that China's been emphasizing, that Washington is dividing the world. I guess, Sine, that kind of brings us nicely, I think, to you. Saudi Arabia, their response to the Ukraine-Russia situation, how it's impacted their diplomacy. I mean, obviously, it's brought up the price of energy, but they haven't necessarily, I think, been in the Western camp, on Ukraine. Has that kind of reshuffled things from Riyadh's perspective?
Thank you, John. So regarding the Saudi perspective on how things evolve in Ukraine, it's definitely fair to say that they haven't been included in the Western camp. And I'd rather say they're trying to play their cards well. They're keeping a rather cautious stance in that regard. But what I'd also like to perhaps add a new dimension on is the Chinese involvement in the Russian-Iran equation in Ukraine. So we are seeing early telltale indicators of China weighing in and using the leverage it acquired over Iran to use Iran as a back channel to support Russia in Ukraine. So we're seeing that this can come in the forms of financial aid and as well as arms and ammunition, such as the artillery shells that Russia is currently lacking to a great extent. So that can really be a new trend that can complicate the things both between the countries and both on the battlefield against Ukraine's favor. And we're expecting this to occur around the same time as a expected spring-summer Ukrainian counteroffensive. So in a few months, we can expect China to have a more expanded yet a more behind-the-scenes involvement in Ukraine through Iran. Like I said, this is still yet to be fully verified or falsified, but we're seeing early indicators of that. So I wanted to add that in to the discussion. So, yep, that's my take from my end.
Thanks, Sine. I actually just shared your recent article for China Brief with everyone. Sine really wrote a great breakdown of Iran's role in channeling arm or military assistance from China to Russia. So that's the current edition of China Brief. Encourage everyone to check that out. Great. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. I do like to give everyone a chance. Any last words, final takeaways, Andrea, Alex, or Sine, that you would kind of leave us with here? Great. Well, thanks, everyone. Oh, Alex?
No, just wanted to thank you for the opportunity. Wonderful panel. Great to be with Andrea and Sine. And again, I enjoyed it very much. Thank you for hosting us.
Great, thank you. No, thanks for joining us, and really appreciate hearing your perspectives. I'm not a Middle East expert, and it's kind of great to bring in the different perspectives from the different regions. So this is fantastic, and look forward to future opportunities to collaborate. This will be available on jamestown.org, our website, on our YouTube channel, and our events page as well. So encourage everyone to revisit this discussion. Thanks so much, Andrea, Alex, Sine, and our audience for joining us today.